Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else joining this webinar today that we have on parliamentary oversight. Now, Parliament has gotten under a lot of scrutiny over the last couple of weeks, months, and years, not the least due to state capture. And this is something that the Organization Undoing Tax Abuse has been covering in our work on parliamentary oversight over the last couple of years. Central to all of this is actually asking then, what are the roles of members of parliament towards ensuring that us as citizens get what we deserve in terms of service delivery and our interests to being looked after. I would like to read to you a very short extract of an MP's oath of office and something that they swear once they get elected and start representing the South African Republic in Parliament. They state, "I solemnly affirm that I will be faithful to the Republic of South Africa and will obey, respect, and uphold the Constitution and all other law of the Republic. And I solemnly promise to perform my functions as a member of the National Assembly to the best of my ability. So help me God." Now, once again, this is an oath that all MPs have to swear. And if this oath was kept by and abided to, we would not be having this webinar today together with our esteemed guests. This then leads me to quickly introduce each of our guests before we start in earnest the content of this webinar. First of all, we have Gregor Jakke. He is currently the resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung of South Africa. From January of 2019 to April 2022, Gregor was the head of the Syria and Iraq office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And he particularly focused on, while he was posted in Kenya, on strengthening the capacities of state and non-state actors for an effective decentralized governance. And then he also worked within the Democratic Republic of the Congo to head the Foundation's country project and a project on food security from 2016 and 2018. We wish to thank you heartily for being here, Gregor, and also to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for funding not only this event, but the entire project on parliamentary oversight. Then we have Davie Pelle from the Public Affairs Research Institute. Davie is a researcher for the State Reform Program at PARI in Johannesburg. She is an interdisciplinary social scientist focusing on the anthropology, sociology, and history of the state in South Africa. Her expertise is in the field of corruption, state capture, oversight, and accountability. Hello, Davie. It's great having you here. And then finally, representing the Institute for African Alternatives, we have Moira Levy. Moira is the media manager at the Institute for African Alternatives and its production manager of the organization's flagship journal, New Agenda, which is South African Journal of Social and Economic Policy. She's also the project leader of the Institute for African Alternatives in defense of our constitutional democracy project, also known as Decode. This project organizes public engagements to address the failure of our democratic parliament to fulfill its cardinal and constitutional duty to exercise oversight over the executive branch of government, including organs of state and state-owned enterprises. So I'm sure you can all agree we have very esteemed guests on our panel, and we do look forward to jumping into this webinar, examining different elements of parliamentary oversight, gaps, but also opportunities, we hope. So first of all, if I could ask, Gregor, representing the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, thank you once again for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. The Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is a German political foundation that is affiliated to the Christian Democratic Union, the political party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. There are 6 German political foundations operating in South Africa. The system of political foundations in Germany goes back to the time after Second World War, when Germany had to invest in its reconstruction. In terms of strengthening its young democracy, this also involved teaching its citizens about civic education. Apart from the work in Germany, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung started its international cooperation over 60 years ago. Currently, we work in more than 100 countries worldwide together with local partners, focusing our work on promoting value-based, multi-party democracy, good governance, human rights, and the rule of law. CAS has been active in South Africa since the 1980s and helped with the transition to democracy by bringing legal experts from Germany to assist with the drafting of the Constitution of South Africa, which is considered as one of the most modern, liberal, and egalitarian in the world. CAS implements its activities with local partners, such as civil society organizations, universities, think tanks, political partners, and many others. And we are pleased to partner with OUTA. This project is a vital contribution to democracy in South Africa. Empower MPs and strengthen. And a well-working parliament will not only represent the electorate and execute the citizens' interest, but also oversee the government properly. And by the way, state capture was only one example that underlines the fact that parliament's institutional defenses and accountability mechanisms remain weak. The project is timely as South Africa prepares for the general elections of 2024, where eligible voters will be fulfilling their civic duty to vote and thus select their representatives in parliament and in the provincial legislatures. It also encouraged the apathetic citizens to take their power back and vote. As we all know, South Africa is unfortunately dealing with numerous challenges of load shedding, unemployment rate over 30%, high crime rate, and many others. Consequently, it is imperative for every eligible voter to exercise their democratic right and vote. South Africa is a parliamentary democracy. Accordingly, everyone who lives in this country relies on the members of parliament to represent them and perform their oversight role. Therefore, for parliament to function well, it requires MPs who understand their duties and responsibilities and executes their tasks diligently. A weak parliament is detrimental to a functioning democracy. I would like to thank OUTA for the good cooperation since 2021, when our partnership began with the book Permitted Plundering: How Parliament Failed South Africa. In 2022, we cooperated on the electoral reform report, and we look forward to a productive future cooperation. Let me also take the opportunity to thank the panelists and facilitator and everyone who has joined. I look forward to interesting and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Gregor. And once again, we would like to thank the support that has been provided by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for realizing this project on parliamentary oversight, looking at challenges and also opportunities. Now, part of the project and its funding by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung was not only to compile a report that we will hear the representation by from Davie, but also a number of other products. What we have found in our work on parliamentary oversight, it's not just something that we could report on in reports that can go and sit on shelves and potentially gather dust only for academics, researchers, and policymakers to read. It ought to be more accessible And it ought to be a tool to be used by the public to know that we essentially have a say. We are the bosses. We pay the public sector servants. So how do we then ensure that what we are doing gets to the public? Not only then in terms of the webinar, but we also developed a very basic, easy to use dashboard, of which the links will be shared. And this dashboard tracks the quantitative, or those elements that we can count that is important for parliamentary oversight. These look at number of meetings that are being held by portfolio committees, the attendance rate of the executive, meaning ministers and deputy ministers. We also look at the number of activities where the public is being engaged with in terms of public participation, whether it's on hearings for bills or even just to get their input on how things can be made better. We also look at the number of engagements with civil society organizations and other research tanks and policymakers. We feel this is important because based on our research in the past, it does seem as though Parliament functions really well, if one could say that, as a silo, where within its structures, they are operating in a very insular way, where the content and research being received is being conducted in-house or through government departments, but we're not getting input from other members of society that could add value to Parliament. And this makes for a type of an echo chamber where the same messages are being resonated time and again. As part of OUTA's parliamentary oversight report, specifically the one that was published in this year, aptly titled Parliament, the Fairy Tale That Became a Nightmare, we have found that it does not seem that the state of Parliament is improving. In 2019, our report asked why non-performing MPs continue to reappear and serve as members of Parliament. In 2020, we noted that there's a current political system that seems to reward unethical behavior of members of Parliament. And we are seeing in the media over the last couple of weeks instances where the Committee on Ethics and Members' Interests have been given very lean penalties to MPs that have been found wanting, if they get penalized at all. In 2021, we found that Parliament is being hollowed out due to state capture and those having been involved, with members of Parliament and of the executive held accountable or actually held liable for their actions and contributions to state capture. And we are still waiting for them to be held accountable. In this year's report, we do have a stern warning that for South Africa's Parliament to fulfill its democratic role, it must come back to what its course ought to be, to serve the people. We have found that Parliament is deviating from its province of safeguarding democracy, and it has evolved into a dysfunctional institution. Unfortunately, this transformation has characterized as a departure from the ideal, akin to a burnt-out shell where commitment to democratic values and constitution has waned. And we are concerned when looking at the 2024 national and provincial elections that if the structural issues in Parliament is not being attended to, that these same issues are going to continue within the 7th administration. So this is the context that we are dealing with. We do have CUS and other entities that are supportive of raising awareness and wanting to contribute to the dialogue. And this does give me the opportunity to be so happy to ask Davie Pelle from PARI to present on her contribution in terms of this project funded by CUS on parliamentary oversight. Davie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So Davie, now we reached out to you as OUTA to look into challenges and opportunities presented to Parliament. But this is not the first time that you've been engaging with Parliament at all in terms of your research. So what have you been doing within this platform of parliamentary oversight?
That's true. So Let me answer that on two levels. The first is, PARI as an organization, the academic research organization, and particularly my program, the State Reform Program, really focuses on building a state, a public administration that's capable, that is capacitated, that can serve its democratic mandate. And a lot of the work that we do, ends up with sort of these practical evidence-based recommendations for reform. Now, when you're trying to build a capable state, we've seen very clearly that there's a breakdown in the oversight and accountability that's a critical part of that. So I think this is it's a very opportune time for PARI to start working on the legislature side of things. Myself, I was previously a researcher and an analyst at the State Capture Commission, the Zondo Commission, where part of my work involved going through all of the evidence, so the statements and the transcripts for the witness hearings for the parliamentary oversight work stream there. So I've become extremely familiar with the archive. So there were a lot of witnesses who appeared before the commission, and they gave incredibly detailed testimony. And some of them had been in Parliament for quite a long time. So they were able to give a sort of historical overview of how accountability processes within Parliament have evolved over time and broken down. So that was a very important primary source for our research.
Thank you so much for that, Davie. And I can imagine with your previous exposure being part of the Zondo Commission and the research being conducted there, that your exposure has been quite immense. Maybe just a very short off question. Do you think that there are gaps in parliamentary oversight?
That's a great starter question. Definitely. So if you read our report, you'll see that our conclusion is ultimately that parliamentary oversight is incredibly uneven. So it largely is exercised through portfolio committees within the National Assembly. Some of those do actually work quite well, and there are MPs who are strongly committed to upholding their duties of oversight and accountability. But the performance is very uneven. Most of the committees don't function that well, and there are very clear gaps. But the gaps are in terms of how Parliament is using the tools that are available to it and how Parliament is exercising their powers. We found that these tools and powers are generally sufficient. So it's not a problem of whether the institution itself is empowered. It is an issue of how committees and how MPs work to fulfill those obligations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Davie. And of course, I mean, being critical as to parliamentary oversight and then also, in general, the role of members of parliament, we do also take note that Parliament is not just members of Parliament, right? Parliament consists of so many functions, whether core business and institutional support. There's a public education office that's really trying their best to promote awareness on Parliament. And I mean, resources is an issue for everybody, right? Even for parliamentarians as an institute. I can imagine, though, in conducting this research from OUTA and PARI, there will be critiques saying, hey, we are on the outside, we're not really seeing what is happening internally at Parliament. How can we actually give an objective opinion of what's really going on? And this was a research question that you struggled with in producing this report and putting together your research, is how do you get the perspectives from the people on the inside? So perhaps tell us a bit about the methodology you followed in preparing this report.
Cool, thanks, Rachel. So as I mentioned before, we used a lot of the information that's come out of the Zondo Commission archive. So those are witness statements by current and former MPs that are really quite detailed. So that's a very rich resource for us. In addition to that, we conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with quite a large range of people inside and outside of Parliament. So we've spoken to sort of experts in the field of parliamentary oversight as part of those interviews. We also spoke to reporters, parliamentary reporters who cover Parliament as their sort of everyday beat. But the vast majority of the research work that we've done is talking to MPs from various parties, as many as we could convince to speak to us, although we have sort of blanket promise of anonymity so that people would feel comfortable talking to us, and also to people from different parts of the support services in Parliament, which was incredibly enlightening. So we spoke to content advisors, to researchers, people from various offices like the PBO, and we spoke to quite a few people who have been in Parliament over multiple terms to provide these support services, who are able to give us a real wealth of insight. So I hope we've accurately reflected their inputs, and combining that with a lot of secondary research that's been produced by experts in the field like PMG. So I think overall we've done a quite careful, nuanced job, or at least we've tried to.
Yes, well, Davie, I suppose I could say we're a bit too close to the project, but I do feel that the report has been conducted and composed with integrity, and it's a very useful resource for everybody that are currently here and listening in, and thank you for everybody joining the webinar, but also for other researchers and policymakers. I am seeing really good questions in the chat, and I will get to the questions a bit later. But something that piqued my interest as a researcher, and that is something that for me spoke to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If we start thinking about restorative justice, how do we make amends to what has happened in the past? And I feel a similar tone was conveyed in terms of the responsibilities of Parliament being one of the three legs of the state, with the judiciary and the legislature and the executive. But you differentiate between explanatory and amendatory accountability. So perhaps if you can give us a bit of a differentiation, why is this different and why is it important?
Sure. So this is a concept that's not new. As far back, there was a pretty important report that was conducted by Professor Hugh Corder and others. They were commissioned by Parliament to produce this report on oversight and accountability, I think in 1999. That's where the distinction comes from. And you can see it coming through in the sort of evolution of parliamentary oversight policy kind of through the years. So the differentiation here is that accountability requires both an explanatory component and an amendatory component. So explanatory is most of what we see when we look at the kind of work that Parliament does every day. It's basically calling on the executive branch of government to explain themselves. And this is through the reports that they have to submit on a regular basis of all sorts of different types. It's when they appear in front of the portfolio committees. It's when MPs make use of their powers to ask questions in like a written and answer format, or when, ministers or the president appears before the plenary for question and answer sessions. So this is essentially wherever the executive is being called to give information about what they're doing and explain why they are performing the way that they are. And we see that this is sort of the level where Parliament is kind of, for the most part, functioning pretty okay. The next level then is amendatory accountability, which is quite simply the fact that in order for there to be true accountability, the executive really has to amend. It has to make things right where there has been found to be a fault. So what we've seen over time in Parliament is that MPs can often quite vigorously criticize the executive, call them to account, demand explanations and so on and so forth. But we are missing that second level of where there is an actual result where the executive is forced to correct course. And we found this distinction very useful for understanding oversight and accountability.
Exactly. the force to change course and to put things in place to make those corrections. Some of the questions that we've got really speak well towards public participation, which is really important, and particularly with our eyes on 2024 and the elections. But there's a specific question from Angus that I do want to ask, and this might speak to your experience in both the State Capture Commission, Davie, and this report. But Angus asks, hi, did anyone try and walk the processes within Parliament? So, for example, considered reporting to Parliament or trying to ask Parliament for help?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question here, Rachel. There's been many cases where civil society organizations and ordinary citizens have reported things to Parliament and requested intervention from parliamentary committees and so on and so forth. There is a function where you can petition committees of Parliament, but again, how this is used in reality is vastly, vastly uneven. I'm not sure if I'm managing to get to what this question is.
No, that's fine. And I think it speaks to our experience as well, where we have been trying to reach out to Parliament on a number of levels in terms of making submissions or, having opinions. And then we don't get the responses that we were hoping for, if we get responses at all. So I think this is like a dual nature of communication, right? That there are many people that are available and that would like to collaborate. It has to be a two-way street in the end that we are experiencing. So perhaps, Davie, if there's one item from this report that has stuck with you in this process, what would it be?
Can I say two things, Rachel?
Even three, but yes.
I think the first thing is that what we found is that Parliament does adhere quite strongly to the sort of routines of oversight. So in terms of process, there is strong compliance there. They go through all of the report, they have all the meetings that they're supposed to have, they call the members of the executive that they're supposed to call. So in terms of the routines, they're compliant with what they're supposed to do. But we found that although there are pockets of excellence within Parliament, on the whole, this doesn't really translate to meaningful accountability and oversight. And we found sort of, I'd say, two reasons for this. The first is that, and I mean, this is not new to anyone, it's the same findings from the Zondo Commission, for example, and similar to what OUTA has been saying for years, which is that the political environment actually does disincentivize true accountability. It's a strong finding. It's come through from basically every MP and every person within Parliament that we've spoken to, is that it makes it difficult for those who are truly committed to strong oversight. And the second is that portfolio committees, although there are some exceptions to this rule, tend to work in very ineffective and counterproductive ways. And this was a frustration felt by many people that we spoke to. And and myself, as part of someone in civil society who frequently follows the activities of portfolio committees, it's very clear to see that the way that these committees tend to work doesn't meaningfully facilitate oversight. It lends itself to very kind of superficial engagement with the executive and kind of hampers your ability to make to properly engage and to form real resolutions for improvement.
Absolutely. So then what it is we are seeing in many instances on paper, it can look like there's a lot happening, the boxes are being ticked, but what we are finding that is missing is meaningful work and oversight and participation that is required. I would like to hand over to Moira. Moira, you've got years of experience in dealing with Parliament. Is what Davie's saying resonating with your experience?
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, very strongly. And the report, PARI's recent report, and the one you're referring to now, resonates strongly. It's an excellent report. I recommend that people read it. because it provides a tool for all of those of us, and there are many civil society organizations now working in the area, mobilizing for electoral reform and parliamentary reform. What Davie is saying about the effectivity of oversight, parliamentary oversight, suggests to me that, in fact, the political will is missing. I think there's compliance on the level, as you say, of what the parliamentary rules stipulate, even what the legislation is provided for. In fact, with the constitution in place, the conditions are there for the delivery of oversight. But somehow, what you talk, the amendatory oversight that you refer to is not being accomplished in any way. And I think it's, I can only agree that that is a serious weakness, and it can only, we need to address this as a function of how to produce proper oversight. I think what we've got to take into account is that the political, the party and the dominance of the ruling party holds MPs too strongly under their own power. MPs cannot actually exercise oversight unless they are independent of the parties and the people who put them into those seats. They were not placed in their seats in Parliament by us, the voters. They were chosen because they went on a party list, and that's the ruling party and all the other parties. And unfortunately, it's obvious that the requirements for making it onto a party list are loyalty to a party, a long history of service to a party. What we want of our representatives is independence from all of that. We want those who have been now appointed to Parliament, in the administration as well as the House. We'd like them to know that whoever you were working for before, you no longer work for. You now work for us. And true parliamentary and true oversight requires that parliamentarians in committees, in plenaries, in question time, are able to stand up against their own parties. This is what Zondo's referred to. This is what many people have referred to from way back to Van Zyl-Slabbit's commission. Parliamentarians have to be protected so they can independently represent interests and, where necessary, stand up to their parties in defense of the needs and demands of the people that they represent, us.
Mm. Thank you for that, Moira. So, I mean, in essence, it has to be always public before party. And I know we can all start preparing for the elections next year. We know what happens in the weeks before elections take place. There are food parcels being handed out, road shows being held, and caps and T-shirts, and promises are being made. But then once those boxes have been ticked again, it's like everybody just goes behind closed doors again and go on with what matters for the party and playing towards the party's needs. If we do consider oversight, Moira, and I'm going to refer to the question posed by Tamsanqa Malilo, that asks, is the oversight role of Parliament different from what you would normally do under monitoring and evaluation? And if it is different, is it effective? Is it more effective? And then what happens if the executive ignores reports being submitted to it?
Well, that's a really good question, and thank you for it. In my attempt to answer, I would say yes. Oversight, the oversight role of Parliament is very different to tracking and monitoring. There's some tracking and monitoring involved in what, for example, committees do. They need to be able to ensure that what they've instructed and requested of the executive is delivered, and they have to meet certain requirements on that. But oversight is more a case of calling our government to account, making sure that it complies with the Constitution and all its promises that it's made. Oversight is a political responsibility stipulated in the Constitution. And a democracy cannot function. Well, I would say we at IFA, where I work, we believe that a democracy cannot work if Parliament doesn't work. And by implication, Parliament cannot work if oversight doesn't work, because that is Parliament's one of its key roles. It's responsible for citizen participation, also for making legislation, but above all, it's got to be able to check whether Parliament, when and if the government is stepping out of line, because we've seen what happens when Parliament fails to conduct that kind of oversight. It's been pointed out again and again, and now we had state capture, and that's because Parliament failed to conduct oversight. That is what Zondo said, and it's patently obvious that in this failure of oversight, the state was able to spin off in a direction that is not serving the people, that's serving the party, in fact, members of the elite. So when you ask to other responsibilities, I think it has a specific duty. And I think the one issue when you ask, is it effective? Here's the thing, it's based very much on the separation of powers. And this, and according to this principle, Parliament can call any executive member of the executive to account. The ministers, they have to comply. It's stipulated in the law, but Parliament cannot tell them what to do. So I think that's where a mandatory kind of accountability comes in. There must be some kind of provision, and this was raised in the Zondo Commission. I mean, it did suggest in one of these recommendations that some kind of legislative changes are introduced to allow for that kind of recourse and response to what is wrong, and that kind of, so there's a limit to how effective this kind of, I believe there's a limit to how effective this kind of oversight can be if it can't transform into a mandatory oversight that looks for changes, amendments, and some kind of addressing of the problems identified in oversight. So that's where I think oversight faces a limitation, a very serious one.
Thank you for that, Moira. And for me, that then translates again that we have an instance where meaningful work is something that could be lacking, but then also enforcement is something that could then also be lacking, because you can make recommendations. We do see it in the annual budget review and recommendation reports that there are these long documents with great recommendations and reports from the Auditor General and the state of the government department. The portfolio committees make them recommendations for what the departments must do, but there are really no mechanisms with which to punish government departments if they fail to do so. I do want to go to another question received, and for both of you, Moira and Davie. Davie, I'm going to hand over to you first. If we speak about oversight of the executive, we all imagine in our mind the building of Parliament, the images, but MPs do not just sit and serve within Parliament. MPs also have got duties towards constituencies that they get allocated to over constituency leave periods for weeks within a calendar year, right? So that's also an important mechanism for constituency engagement. Now, the question was posed by Lolo Ngubeni, and this speaks to public participation and education happening on the ground, which is something you would expect within a constituency leave period will take place by MPs and their officers, right? That's my assumption, of course. But Laura asks, what is the reach of educational interventions as far as reaching our townships and within informal settlements, as an example? Lolo states that they are keen to establish or support such if there's an existing footprint. The one is speaking towards constituencies, and the other one to public education initiatives. In your report, you do refer to constituencies, but I don't know what your opinion is in terms of, you look at constituency responsibilities of MPs, but then also on the ground public participation and education initiatives.
Thanks, Rachel. It's not something we covered in too much detail in the report. South Africa doesn't really have a constituency system, so your MPs are not elected by a particular constituent. So although MPs might do constituency work, there isn't an accountability relationship there at all. So we found that some MPs cared quite a lot about kind of going into their communities and hearing from people and so on and so forth. It's also because the kinds of MPs that wanted to engage with us and wanted to participate in this research project are more likely to be that kind of MP. We've also heard that quite a few MPs just don't engage in this kind of work. So like everything, I would say that if there is reach into informal settlements, rural areas and things, I'd say it is very uneven. In terms of general sort of public participation, we found that people within Parliament and people outside of Parliament tend to think of it exclusively in the realm of legislation. So in terms of the lawmaking powers of Parliament, they are mandated to do all sorts of consultations and things like that. They don't tend to conceive of parliamentary oversight as something where we should be including a public participation element. And I think this is something that really deserves to be thought about a lot more. But in terms of the public participation that does happen, we've found as well that it is often reduced to a sort of tick box exercise, a process compliance. Did we consult all of the relative stakeholders? We can kind of check the box and move on, and not meaningfully engaging with the concerns are brought up. So there's a lot to be desired here. As far as how effective the sort of public education in Parliament is, I'm afraid I can't really speak to that. It's not something that we investigated as part of this report.
Thank you so much for that, Davie. Perhaps Moira, I don't know from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well. Constituency work from Parliament, given that we don't have a constituency-based electoral system, is a bit of a farce. It's not even a requirement of parties to exercise constituency work. Parties, to my understanding, can choose whether they want to have constituencies or not. And there's some parties that are much more rigorous about it than others. For example, constituency officers. I labored for many years under the misapprehension that the local, what turned out to be the constituency office, I thought it was the ANC branch office. It's very hard to know where your constituency office is and where the constituency work takes place. In my experience, and I worked for a number of years at Parliament in the information content department, even MPs, even Parliament could not really stipulate where the constituencies were and where the constituency work is happening. And I think I'm correct in saying that there's some members who conducted constituency work out of the boots of their cars. Constituency work is not properly established. It's not built into our culture. It's not built into our Parliament, but it's not built into our culture. And that's where, when we talk about the need for a constituency-based electoral system, that in itself, legislation to allow people to choose representatives from their constituency, in itself is not quite enough. As citizens, we have to know what we want and expect and can expect from our members. And our representatives, and we need to be able to call them to account. That's a really effective constituency work, and that's where education comes in. And I want to acknowledge that Parliament's education department and outreach department is very effective, and they really do work on the ground, trying to get to ordinary South Africans and share what needs to be known about Parliament. But I still think that to get party members out there and to get oversight activity happening at a constituency level has not been accomplished, and it's very hard to accomplish.
Indeed, Moira, and I know the topic for this discussion isn't constituency effectiveness or oversight. It certainly is important if we do consider budget allocations through provincial legislatures to do constituency work, and through Parliament. This is other research that OUTA has been engaged with. My Vote Counts do work a lot with political party funding, etc. I just double checked. A Parliament does have 18 weeks allocated to constituency leave for 2023. That is approximately 35% of the year being allocated to something we quite have a big question mark over, right? Exactly what do they do? How does it work? Where they are? What are the requirements? For 34%, it's quite a high. And then we don't even reckon in actual leave when Parliament is closed. That certainly is something for us to explore more. But Moira, certainly the Institute for African Alternatives, you weren't involved in this research project on the PARI report and funded by CUS. But I know you do have other projects going on, such as Decode. Would you like to tell us more about what it is that the Defend Our Constitutional Democracy project seeks to do?
Thanks, Rachel, for that opportunity. Defend Our Democracy, or Decode, because we have to have, in South Africa, we have to have an acronym for everything we do. Decode started off in 2019 with a project called Checks and Balances. And we produced a report at that stage, Checks and Balances, subtitled The Auditor General Report. And that came out with our founder, the late Professor Ben Turok, who used to be an ANC MP. He raised the issue, was very angry about this. He was angry about a lot of things that were going wrong in our country, but he was very angry about what he saw as the Auditor General reports that was revealing serious misspending by government departments, particularly badly at that time. And he wanted a study and action from IFA to look at that, because he said the problem lies not in the government misspending, it's in Parliament's failure to monitor that and to demand oversight over that spending. Parliament is failing in its task. And the same conclusion was produced by Zondo in the end. In the end, it's Parliament's failure to conduct oversight that led to state capture. So that is where we started out with our project. We looked at the Auditor General's report. We got a lot of responses from people within Parliament. The late Auditor General spoke to us about it. As I say, the situation has helped a lot, but the problem remains is that does Parliament exercise sufficient oversight? And that is the focus of this webinar and of our work. One of the slogans that we've adopted in our project is democracy cannot work if Parliament doesn't work, and I've said it before. So Decode has tried to engage with Parliament and civil society, and both of them together, in an effort to try and open up the way for any mutual initiatives for reform. I want to state, this relates to an earlier question that you raised, that when we set out with this project, we did a lot of consultation, and we found Parliament itself quite receptive. Now, let me rephrase that. We found the parliamentary administration actually quite receptive to the work we were doing. We met with the Secretary to Parliament, we met with all his team, the chief executives. We met with the Education Department. They recognized the needs for some reform, and they recognized the need to take Zondo's recommendation seriously, and there is a mood for that. But to talk about the House and to get the members to actually come to the party, especially those of the ruling party, is very difficult, because that, as you say about a mandatory over accountability, it requires the executive to admit that something is wrong, and that not be defensive about it, and not to try and preserve the status quo. So that is what Institute for African Alternatives and our Decode project is really trying to do, is not parliamentary bashing. We're very firm on that. This is not a time in South Africa to be fighting with Parliament. The country is in too much trouble right now. This is a time to be working with Parliament, and many parts of Parliament, any individuals seem to agree with that kind of notion, and that's what we're trying to do. Zondo set out a blueprint. That blueprint was set out, the startings of it, by Van Zyl Slabbert more than 20 years ago. It's been said, Davie referred to the OVAC model of Hugh Corder, the Oversight and Accountability model. There's a blueprint that has to be followed to revive and reform our Parliament. And IFA, or Decode's objective, is to try and do whatever to keep that in the public eye, to keep that. There's too many previous commissions and reports that are gathering dust on shelves somewhere. Can't let Zondo's report be forgotten. His response, his recommendations have to be taken up. Our democracy is at risk if it's not.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Moira. And what you rightly indicate, I mean, it isn't parliament bashing or only parliament bashing, and it relates to what I mentioned earlier. If we look at oversight of parliament and we're critical, we realize parliament isn't just MPs, and we realize it's not all MPs. There are many other functions that are trying their best under challenging circumstances, but we are aware that there are failures. Quite a couple of questions in the chat box speak to what will we deem as effective oversight. Davie, in the PARI report, I would like to recommend anybody to go read the report, when you go read the report, please check out page 55. 55 has got this lovely table with easy to use, or at least straightforward recommendations. But Davie, perhaps if you could give an indication, what would effective oversight look to you like?
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, that's not an easy question. When we talk about a mandatory accountability, that's a very thorny question politically for a reason, because of the question of separation of powers, because of the question of where the power of the legislature ends and the power of the executive begins. So it can't be as simple as Parliament, telling the executive what to do and the executive doing that. So let me look at this kind of in two areas. First, in terms of kind of processes, and then in terms of outcomes. In terms of processes, we've put quite a lot of thought into this in our report. Like what does an effective committee look like? What does an effective MP look like? And this kind of work is aimed at ensuring that the engagements that happen within these portfolio committees is as meaningful and as effective as possible. And that means, identifying the right questions. It means having engagements with the executive that isn't a simple Q&A round, but allows one to actually have follow-up questions, to demand information, and has ongoing engagements that are sort of monitored and followed through, and so on and so forth. It requires that MPs are properly capacitated. We have incredibly high turnover, for example, in our parliament. A lot of that experience and skills gets lost. And even if people would want to be committed to oversight, I mean, they still need a sort of baseline of skill and expertise in order to engage meaningfully with that. It means properly resourcing these committees, especially in terms of their research support and so on and so forth that are so important. So we've got quite a few proposals for that in our report as to how can the ways that Parliament work be more effective. In terms of outcomes, I think ultimately what we would like to see is, first of all, that instead of just sort of interrogating the reports of the executive, we see a Parliament that makes kind of well-defined, strong recommendations based on those engagements. So not simply to say, it's unacceptable that you overspend by this much, but to actually engage with questions of the chain of accountability. What is the minister doing? What's the executive action there? What are the problems that have been identified, and what does Parliament recommend be done? And then we need a robust system where those recommendations are followed up on. And if the executive decides not to implement those recommendations, which is their right as the executive, they should still be called to account and to explain why that has happened and what they decided to do instead to fix that problem. So it's not a case of receiving a report, making a comment about the report, and then having this pile of condemnations or critiques or whatever at the end of the day, because that hasn't been effective oversight. It needs to be an ongoing situation where the question being asked by Parliament is, what is the executive doing? And are they fulfilling their responsibilities? And where can we intervene to make strong recommendations to make sure that they are fulfilling their obligations?
That's quite a robust answer. Thank you so much for that, Davie. Moira, from your side, what would you like to add for what would effective oversight look like? And then in particular within the scope of Decode, I know you've got other activities still occurring in this year. So yes, what would effective oversight within Parliament look like to you?
This is like a wish list you're asking for. Rachel, I think the reference that you make to the PARI report, the table that sets out the themes that are the gaps that there are in oversight, what Parliament can do about it, what civil society can do about it. That's excellent. It really is a very useful guide to what can be done. But ultimately, there's a real problem, and that is we need the political will to allow oversight. And that is a real problem because, if you look at the run-up to the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, that started off years ago, about 20, I can't remember, 17, 18. That started off with an attempt to get some kind of oversight activity going in committees. And Parliament was not receptive to that at all. It took a lot of forcing to them to pay attention to what was coming out in the OUTA leaks. And a decision was eventually taken that 4 committees would be called in and told to conduct oversight. It was Home Affairs, Public Enterprises, I can't remember the other 2. They didn't do it. The only Public Enterprises actually conducted that, and that was because a very amazing, independent-minded chairperson of that committee of Public Enterprises stuck her neck out, and she got it chopped off, by the way, because she never got back onto the party list after that. She went in, she defied the party very bravely, called in a lot of outside resources from civil society and elsewhere, and conducted an excellent investigation into what the OUTA leaks were showing in the area of her committee's purview. I think Zondo has even said in his report that the problem is that Parliament has showed a reluctance, a real reluctance, and it's the party that has showed a real reluctance. The problem is that when the issues first came up of some kind of oversight committee, Parliament put it to the vote, and the party members can only vote with what their party's decision, which is So the chief whip decides, and the parties and the ANC voted no. And until members are, first of all, protected enough from that, the jobs should be secured, and this is something that Zonda refers to. As soon as the members are allowed to act independently and are empowered, not only by the skills in trading and that you mentioned, but also empowered by us, the citizens, saying that we support you because we voted for you, and if you don't deliver, we won't vote for you again, but if you do deliver, we've got your back. I think political will is lacking. So when we talk about excellent, necessary oversight, we have faced an enormous challenge. We're over and above the challenges of weak committees, lack of resources, weak research capacity, etc. We have the lacking in political will of the ruling party, and that's crucial.
Absolutely. And speaking of the State Capture Commission and the resulting recommendations, next week there is a big event taking place on this, hosted by PARI and the Council for the Advancement of South Africa's Constitution, CASAC. Davie, do you perhaps want to just give a brief overview of this conference next week, and can people still register to attend online?
Sure, thanks, Rachel. This is a follow-up to a conference that we held, PARI and CASAC jointly, a year ago, in which we sort of explored and interrogated the recommendations that were made by the Zondo Commission. So, which ones were the sort of key levers that we could identify to advocate for that would lead to real estate reform and so on and so forth. What we're doing this year as a follow-up is to assess what progress has there been on the implementation of those recommendations? What still needs to be done? Where have things kind of gone wrong? Where have we seen positive developments, so on and so forth? So we've got a number of panels. One of them is on parliamentary oversight. There's a few others, for example, on the criminal justice system, on governance and state-owned entities, and so on and so forth. We've got some really great panelists, including contributions from the presidency and the National Anti-Corruption Council. And indeed, you can still register online at PARI's website, which is pari.org.za. It's fully hybrid, so joining online, you'll be able to see and participate in everything. It's on the 25th and the 26th of October.
Thank you so much for that. And we will add the link at the bottom for those of you that want more information and that want to go. Finally, I do want to point to a comment and a question that Karabu posted earlier, and then asking, with the limited resources that Parliament has and other challenges, how do entities such as OUTA go forward in terms of working on parliamentary oversight and collaboration or contributions towards this process? And the best I can say is that we will continue doing this. Entities such as ourselves, PARI, CASAC, the Institute for African Alternatives, and many other civil society organizations will continue doing research and engaging with Parliament and putting reports and other activities out there. We have organizations such as the Parliamentary Monitoring Group that does continue the wonderful work they do to make this information accessible to all of us on what is happening on Parliament. So we could only request you all as citizens to continue being active and to participate in these matters that do affect us all. On a closing note, we do have a video that we can play you regarding parliamentary oversight, what it is, why it matters, what it means, and why we should take note of it. I thank you all for joining us at this webinar.
So, Brath, when you hear the word Parliament, what comes to mind? Do you think of it as a building in Cape Town? Or do you think of all the comedy drama from past owners' speeches?
Order, members. That's completely out of order.
I've been telling him this is not Trevor Noah's show.
But Parliament is so much more than just a meme. It's one of the three pillars of our constitutional democracy. There's the executive, that's the president, deputy president, and their cabinet. There's the judiciary, which are the courts with their judges and magistrates. And there's the legislature, Parliament. Now check here. Parliament consists of two houses, Sinja, that's the National Assembly, and the National Council of Provinces. Combined, Parliament is made up of about 490 members, also called MPs for short. The executive, judiciary, and the legislature. This is the separation of powers as outlined in our constitution to protect our democracy and the rights of the people of South Africa. It's really important that the three pillars operate independently. Sinja, that means Parliament does not work for the executive. In fact, in addition to making and enforcing laws, Parliament is also required by the Constitution to have oversight of the President, Deputy President, and Ministers. In other words, to keep them in check. And not just taking the checks. This is supposed to prevent corruption and make sure that taxpayers' money is spent on improving the lives of South African people, keeping services running, and maintaining things like roads and schools. Members of Parliament may belong to a party, but they actually work for you, person of South Africa. That's right, you're the boss. So act like a boss and hold members of Parliament accountable. Visit the People's Assembly website at pa.org.za to find out who represents you and how to report any issues affecting your community or our country. Remember, members of Parliament take an oath and swear to protect and work for the people of South Africa. So, the next time you hear the word Parliament, know that MPs work for who? For you. Protect your freedom and democracy. Vote in the 2024 elections. Be the boss. Be the change. Vote 2024.